I was working the night shift at my local grocery store back when it used to be open 24 hours a day. There would normally be less than 10 customers throughout my shift, but I wouldn't get to sit around and do nothing. They wanted me to work on stock when I wasn't helping a customer. It was a bigger store, so often there may have been one other person in the building, whether it be someone working on stock or someone cleaning. This night I was the only one working. I was stocking in the cereal aisle when I heard something fall over on the other side of the shelf in the next aisle over. I would always hear the door to the store sliding open. It was the loudest thing ever, so it caught me off guard that there might have been a customer in the building. Of course, it wasn't weird yet. Not until I looked to my left and saw a man standing by the edge of the aisle, shooting me a blank stare. "Do you need something, sir?" I asked him. "No, but could you just point me to the eggs?" he said. He wasn't normal looking. His face looked weird, not exactly ugly, just unusual. His upper lip kind of came out too far, almost like a Simpsons character. I was a bit uncomfortable that I had to deal with ringing him up. I hurried to finish the cereal aisle, and when I was done, I began to bring the U-boat cart to the back room. I was stopped halfway when the same guy cut me off through the middle section of the aisle. I want to note this guy was probably in his mid-30s, and at the time I was only 22, though I looked much younger. The guy stopped me and started trying to make awkward small talk. He started by asking me my name, how old I was, if and where I went to school, and why I was doing the night shift. His questions started to get weirder when he asked me if I went to parties a lot, and if I had a girlfriend. I told him I didn't, and he asked me if I've ever had a boyfriend while putting his hand on my shoulder. I immediately started walking away with the cart, but he followed me. I told him I wasn't into whatever he was thinking about. I went faster and faster until I finally made it to the storage room. He didn't follow me in. I wasn't supposed to stay back there for extended periods to avoid customer theft. I decided it would be best to just wait for him by the register so that he would ring his stuff up and leave. But I waited there for at least 20 minutes. He never came. I decided he was gone, and whether he stole the eggs or something else, there wasn't anything I could do now. I had to go to the bathroom, so I took a quick jog to the back of the store and into the employee bathroom. Moments after sitting on the toilet, my heart dropped into my stomach as I heard the bathroom door open. I choked the urge to say something like, "You can't be in here," but I didn't want to give away my position. I lifted my legs so that I wouldn't be visible from under the stall. What happened next was simply horrifying. I sat there for the longest time, looking at the floor, not moving a muscle. When I finally looked up, I could see an eye peering through the crack of the stall door. I screamed. I knew I was trapped. I knew I had one shot at making a move. I grabbed the box cutter in my pocket and began sliding it through the crack of the door, forcing him to move his eye away. I took that chance to slam the stall door open in his face and hightail it out of the bathroom and all the way out of the store. I called my boss at least 5 times before he finally picked up, and I explained everything. He told me to call the cops, and so I did. Of course, the man wasn't in the store anymore by the time the cops showed up. I only did the night shift twice after that, and luckily didn't see the man again. Before we get into this next story, I want to take a moment to talk about the sponsor for today's video. Aura is an all-in-one digital security service providing continuous monitoring of your personal data, along with quick resolutions to help you resolve any potential threats. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives. It's all out there. This affects nearly 1/3 of all U.S. citizens, and continues to affect 15 million U.S. citizens every single year, costing billions of dollars. That's why I've been using Aura. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it protects me from hackers who could use this information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. I don't know if you saw this, but AT&T revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, were released on the dark web. They recommend those affected use strong passwords, monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. Well, Aura does all this for me, and best of all, I don't have to download several different apps just because a company couldn't keep my data secure. If my info was compromised in the AT&T data breach, I wouldn't worry, because Aura is always on, always doing the hard work of keeping me safe. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to https://aura.com/thecurse to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. I strongly suggest everyone to try it out and keep your identity secure. Don't get cursed. Use Aura and save yourself. I used to work the night shift at a gas station on the side of some highway in the country. From the hours of 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. the road was pretty dead. I would have maybe 1 or 2 people come in to pay cash in a whole night. It was a very boring and depressing job, especially doing the graveyard shift, but I had just finished college and needed to pay off my loans. The only reason I kept this job was because my boss threw me an extra $5 an hour for doing the night shift. On this one cold December night, I was doing my usual thing, reading the newspaper, playing games on my phone, and whatnot, when I noticed the headlights of a car pulling off the highway into the parking lot. It was a red pickup truck. Somebody stepped out and shut the door. I went back to reading the paper as I saw that he was standing by the gas pump. I assumed he wasn't paying cash. I looked up a few moments later and saw that he was still standing in the same position, staring at the gas pump. I almost felt obligated to go out and help him. He was obviously confused. I felt a cold chill run up my spine as I saw the 6-foot-something tall man slowly turn his head to face me. I couldn't make out any features of his face, but I knew he was staring at me. I tried to pretend I didn't notice by going back to reading the paper. Of course, I wasn't really reading now. I was a bit shaken by the guy out there. I just wanted him to pay debit or credit and leave. I looked up and gasped as the man was now much closer to the front door of the building. It wouldn't have been so disturbing if it weren't for the fact that he wasn't moving. He was just standing still as before, still looking in my direction. I walked over to the door to get a closer look. All I could see in his face was still blackness. I locked the door and flipped the open sign to closed. Locking the door without proper cause could possibly get me in trouble, but I was not taking a chance because, quite frankly, I was scared shitless. I walked back behind the counter and sat down on one of the containers on the floor, just so I couldn't see the man outside anymore. I stayed in that position for a good 5 minutes, texting every friend I had to see who was awake. I was desperate to tell somebody about this. When I finally got up to check that he was gone, I let out a full scream as the man was now right outside the door. I picked up the phone on the counter and called the police. The operator was reluctant to send somebody over because of the way I described the situation, but I persuaded them. I hid behind the counter, balled up like a child. I began to hear heavy thumps at the door, not innocent knocks to catch my attention. I mean thuds and thumps trying to break down the door. And then eventually it finally stopped. I heard the sound of a car starting outside and then driving off. I looked outside and he was gone. A patrol cop, along with a state trooper, pulled into the parking lot. I reported the red pickup truck and told them which direction I thought he went in. I couldn't describe his face as all I saw was blackness. Of course, there wasn't much the police could do as the man didn't really do anything. I left that job a few months later for a job in the city. Two years ago, I was called in to do the night shift from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. at 7-Eleven since somebody called out. The store was located on a busy road in a rather quiet and rural area. During the night shift, you could expect anywhere from 10 to 20 people to come in to buy beer or something else. This one particular night, there was this one guy, mid-20s, that came in. He started making weird noises, like loud yelling noises. I assumed he had some kind of mental disability. In fact, my brother has a mental disability, so I immediately felt sympathy for the guy. He walked up to the counter without any items, with his head facing me but his eyes looking up at the ceiling. I felt uncomfortable. I honestly didn't know how to deal with it. I tried speaking with him, but he only responded in loud noises. I kept checking if he was with someone outside, but he was alone. There weren't any cars in the parking lot, so I assumed he walked. He stood there for so long, looking up at the ceiling and making noises, that I tried to get him out by handing him a bag of chips and telling him he could go. I tried finding some kind of number to call for someone to help him. Then, out of nowhere, he finally turned around and walked out of the store. I felt so horrible for the man, but at the same time I felt a bit creeped out. About an hour later, the phone on the counter rang. I picked up to hear the familiar yelling sounds from the man from earlier. It caught me off guard. I didn't know what to think other than this had to be some kind of prank. I hung up on him and was now becoming paranoid of my surroundings, constantly checking the outside through the windows. Come 4 o'clock, the person working after me came in, finally allowing me to go home. It wasn't my problem anymore. I got home and threw all my stuff on the table, ready to get to sleep. But my phone rang within a minute after entering the door. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would someone be calling at 4 a.m.? I could only imagine it was bad news. I braced myself and picked up the phone. It was the man again. I felt sick to my stomach as I listened to the loud noises he made. I struggled to slam the phone back to the receiver. All night, I felt like I was being watched, even with all the blinds shut. I could swear I heard strange noises coming from all over my house. I refused to get any sleep until the sun came up. Weeks passed, and I had forgotten about the incident until one day when I went into the basement for the first time in a while. I found that papers had been scattered all over the floor. When I went into the basement closet, I found writing on the walls. 7-Eleven had been written in Sharpie on the wall, along with the address to the 7-Eleven I worked at and my house address. The most disturbing part was that I also found various kitchen knives, along with a large pocket knife sitting in the closet. What started out as seemingly just an innocent person turning into something of a prank ultimately turned into something much more horrifying. He had been living down there for God knows how long, and I'm just grateful that, for whatever reason, he changed his mind and left because I haven't seen or heard from him since. All I can say is that man is dangerously ill. I've worked in the K-9 unit for 9 years, and I've worked my fair share of graveyard shifts. I've definitely come across weird things at night, but I'll never forget this one night. I worked with my dog Sammy, a German Shepherd. She was 2 years old at the time and still kind of new to the job, just like me. I was driving down a road surrounded by crops when I spotted a suspicious-looking white van parked inside the crops. Both doors were open. I flashed my lights to try and draw out whoever was there. Nobody came out, so I parked and scanned the place quickly. Nobody was in sight, so I took Sammy with me to track down the driver of the van. Sammy started going crazy when we reached the trunk of the van. She was pulling so hard she almost broke off the leash. I opened the trunk to the van, and a blast of foul air hit me in the face. I almost passed out from the mix of the horrible smell and the pure shock of what I saw in the trunk. I counted 7 full body bags, each with a pair of feet sticking out at the bottom. I requested immediate backup with my radio. I heard the sound of a twig snapping nearby, and Sammy just lost it. I lost grip of the leash, and she took off into the crops. I pulled out my gun and followed the sounds of her barking. As each and every crop hit me in the face, I felt as if something would reach out and grab me. I stopped when I could no longer hear Sammy's barking, but as I stopped, the sounds of movement did not. I realized I heard movement in all directions. I had never experienced such fear in my life. I stood still as the movement around me stopped. And then, out of nowhere, I felt 2 arms wrap around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't fight. I was going to die. And then I heard the sound of Sammy's bark, followed by the scream of the man choking me as Sammy bit down on his leg. The next thing I did is something that I still question if it was appropriate to this day. I turned around and pulled the trigger, killing the man. I grabbed Sammy by the leash and ran all the way back to the car. I could tell people were following us from behind. I managed to make it to the car safely and drive a 1/4 mile down the road. I didn't stop to see which way they went. I didn't hold my ground. I fled like a coward. I cared much more about our lives than I did this job, and I'll still say that today. But it still pains me knowing how much of a coward I was. Backup arrived shortly, but the van was gone. I even failed to get the plate number on dashcam video, or even just writing it down. This was within my first few months on the force, but it made me feel like absolute shit for months to come. As someone who swore to protect, let a van full of killers get away. A few years ago, I worked a late shift at a city center club. The job wasn't particularly frightening, except for the state of the girls' toilets at the end of the night. One incident, however, will stay with me for the rest of my life. This story has 2 parts, one considerably scarier than the other. One night close to closing time, I was cleaning out the ice wells and organizing bottles of spirits. A group of people was drinking and dancing nearby, and a moody-looking couple stood against the wall. A younger lad came to the bar, ordered a drink, and tried chatting with the couple. The moody guy was clearly not interested, but the young lad didn't take the hint because he was drunk and in a good mood. The young lad eventually moved on when the moody guy started telling him to get lost. The moody couple finished their drinks and looked like they were leaving. As they passed the younger lad, he waved goodbye, possibly saying something snarky. The moody guy suddenly rushed him and gave him a weak punch. The young lad avoided trouble by ducking out of the way. I instructed one of the younger staff to ensure the couple was escorted out. I thought the situation was over. About 15 minutes later, I went out for a smoke and was shocked to see the young lad with a huge slash on his head, bleeding heavily. People were panicking, trying to keep pressure on the wound and looking out for an ambulance. It was like a scene from a war movie. The door staff asked me to get some paper towels to help stem the bleeding. The young lad was trembling and saying he felt cold, which was chilling since it was a mild autumn night. The next day, I called a friend who sometimes sold me marijuana, telling him about the incident. To my surprise, he knew about it because the injured kid, David, was his boss's little brother. His boss was a big-time dealer in the area, running a serious drug operation under the cover of legitimate businesses. My friend assured me that David was alive but in bad shape. A few days later, I received a call from an unknown number. A guy who worked for the big-time dealer wanted to talk. I thought it would be a phone call, but he arrived at my place and asked me to drive to the dealer's flat. The flat was luxurious, and the dealer, Paul, asked me to tell the police I saw a knife, even though I hadn't. The police needed a stronger case against the attacker, and I agreed to help. Months later, I thought the ordeal was over, but I received another call from an unknown number. This time, when I went to Paul's place, it was filled with mean-looking guys. They showed me CCTV stills from a bar I didn't recognize and asked if I could identify the attacker. After looking through many images, I recognized a guy with strawberry blonde hair. I told Paul, and the room went quiet. Paul drove me home without saying much, which was terrifying. I realized I had condemned a man to a horrible fate, knowing that Paul and his gang would seek revenge. It haunts me to this day, and I try not to think about it. In 2015, I landed my dream job as a manager of an old, rustic pub with stained glass windows and ornate bar fixtures. However, a big brewery company bought the pub, and within 6 months, I lost my job. Desperate to pay rent and bills, I took a job at an off-license in the town center, working the night shift from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. The off-license was busy, especially on weekends. It had a cash machine, sold expensive booze, and was a popular spot for people to buy drinks after the bars closed. On a busy night, we could have over $7,000 in cash on site. One Sunday morning around 5 a.m., just before Christmas, the store had been extremely busy. It was Black Friday and there were office parties in town. By the end of the night, I was exhausted and ready to collapse. I rested my head on the counter when I heard the door beep, signaling a customer. A man who seemed alarmingly sober walked in. Most customers at that time were drunk, but this guy was different. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets and greeted me by name, which made me uneasy. He knew where I lived and asked about my family by name. It was creepy. Then, 2 other men walked in, also sober, and flanked the first guy. The first man politely asked if there was a toilet in the back of the shop. When I confirmed, he told me to go in, lock the door, and not come out for at least half an hour, showing me something heavy in his jacket. I realized they were robbing the place. They took all the CCTV USB sticks, wrecked the monitors, broke into the safe, and emptied the shelves of premium spirits. All the while, I sat in the toilet, terrified and wondering how they knew so much about me. I have worked as a DJ in various clubs for years, but one night at a popular venue, something eerie happened. I was playing my set when I noticed a man in his 40s who seemed out of place. He wasn't dancing or drinking, just watching the crowd. His presence gave me an uneasy feeling, but I continued my set. Later, during a break, I went to the bar and saw the man again. He was talking to a young woman who looked uncomfortable. As I approached, the man suddenly left, and the woman came up to me, visibly shaken. She told me the man had been following her all night, making inappropriate comments. I informed the security staff, and they escorted the man out. The woman thanked me, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that lingered. A week later, I received a message on my DJ page from the same woman, thanking me again for my help. She said the man had been arrested for harassing several women in the area. It was a relief to know he was caught, but the incident made me more vigilant during my sets. I work as an emergency room nurse at a large hospital, and I was working the night shift at the time. During my time on that shift, I saw many strange and shocking things. This story, however, is about the scariest thing that I've ever experienced. My shift began at 10 p.m. and went until 6 a.m. It was a large hospital in the downtown core of the city where I live. There was a whole hospital district in the area. The children's hospital was right next door, and the cancer ward was not far off. It was a warm summer night. The city was dark as I drove my car into the staff parking area. The security guard checked my badge and waved me in. I parked and walked to the entrance like I had many times before. When I stepped into the building, the somber tranquility of the night was replaced by the fast-paced hustle of a big city emergency room. You wouldn't even know it was nighttime in this place. The bright fluorescent lights shone down on the busy hallway, creating a feeling indistinguishable from daytime. The next several hours were fairly normal by my standards. The job, in general, is incredibly hectic, and the night was no different. Basically, it was a typical crazy night. However, things were taken to another level when a new patient entered the emergency room. He burst through the front entrance covered in blood, holding his abdomen. He trudged into the waiting room with a look of agony on his face. He looked to be about 40 years old with long hair. He had a short beard and wore blue jeans. One of the other nurses and I approached him and helped him into the operating room. We cut his shirt off to find the source of the blood. His flannel shirt was heavy, soaked in blood. I think it was supposed to be yellow with a plaid pattern, but it was impossible to tell. All I could see was red. Looking at his bare chest, it was easy to see the wound. It was a clear knife wound on his stomach, on the right side of his body. I quickly stopped the bleeding, and his condition was stabilized. Believe it or not, this kind of thing was actually quite common. The other nurse and I were well within our ability to handle the situation. What happened next is what really terrified me. I was alone with the man. He was conscious but laying still. The stab wound was the only serious injury, but I couldn't help but notice several other injuries on his body. They were not bad enough to require emergency treatment, but there were noticeable scratch marks on his arms and face. They were deep, long marks in rows of 3 or 4. They had surely come from fingernails. My expertise is healthcare. I'm not a detective. I don't have the skills to analyze the meaning of a certain type of wound, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But these scratches looked defensive. I was almost sure of it. This man had done something to someone. My gaze moved slowly from the man's arms to his face. He turned to look at me at the same time, and we locked eyes. We held eye contact for several seconds. My mind was racing. Does he know that I know? I thought. Just then, he tried to reach out and grab my arm. Luckily, my reflexes were faster than his, and I quickly left the room. Fortunately, the police were already there, as is common when there's a stabbing. I told the officer what I had seen, and he assured me that they would look into it. The man was treated for several more hours by my coworker, and eventually the case was turned over to the police. I never found out exactly what happened between this man and whoever else was involved, but my intuition tells me that he was bad news. All I can do is hope that whoever the other person was, they got away in better shape than he did. My father used to work as a guard at a prison, and he often shared stories about some of the crazy things that happened during the day, including fights, riots, and everything you can imagine. The night shift, however, was quite peaceful and relaxing for him. He used to say that once he got used to the sleep schedule, it was the better option. My father would usually patrol the prison a few times per shift, sometimes driving around in one of the guard trucks or keeping watch in one of the towers. However, one night, his boss told him to do a sweep of the prison chapel. It was a simple task, just walk around and make sure no one was there who shouldn't be. He walked through the yard to the chapel, the large empty space giving off an eerie vibe. Bright floodlights on the prison wall cast a long shadow of his body as he trudged past the empty basketball courts. He reached the front door of the chapel and felt a wave of nervousness come over him, though he didn't know why at the time. He pushed the large oak door open and stepped inside, flicked on the light switch, and started checking some of the small rooms at the front of the building. After a few minutes, a man walked out of the office at the back of the chapel. He seemed to be another guard, wearing the same uniform as my father. My dad didn't know this guy, but it wasn't unusual since sometimes guards from the day shift would take a night shift for extra money or to cover for someone. Still, he was confused because his boss had asked him to check the chapel. Why would he do that if someone was already there? My father asked the man, "Are you here to do a sweep of the chapel?" "Yes, I'll take it from here," the man replied. My dad stood there, confused, for several seconds, then said, "Oh, okay, I'll let the boss know," he left the chapel and walked back to his boss's office in the main building. His boss looked up from his desk and said, "How did you get done so fast? You couldn't have possibly checked the whole place in such a short amount of time." Another guard was there. "He said he'd check it out," my dad replied. "Okay, as long as someone checked it," the boss said. My dad was confused at this point. He figured the other guard must have been sent there by someone. If his boss didn't know, then who was that guy? 3 days later, my father was walking down the halls of the prison and stopped to look at the display case. There were various awards and old photos of other guards from times past. As he browsed through the photos, he saw something that made his heart sink. One of the pictures was a memorial to a guard who had been killed in a riot about 20 years ago. The picture was of the guard that my father saw in the chapel that night. He had never been a believer in the paranormal before, but this experience caused him to change his mind. He didn't bother to tell any of his coworkers out of fear that he'd be ridiculed, and not long after, he left the job and made a career change. Although this was a terrifying incident for him, it is one of his favorite stories to tell. I've heard it more than a few times from him, and although I wasn't sure at first, I actually do believe it. My father worked as a night guard at a large prison. He used to tell me about some of the crazy things that happened during the day fights, riots, and everything you can imagine. The night shift, however, was quite peaceful and relaxing. Once he got used to the sleep schedule, he found it to be the better option. One night, his boss asked him to do a sweep of the prison chapel. There wasn't much to it, he said. You just had to walk around and make sure that nobody was there who shouldn't be. He walked through the yard to the chapel. The large, empty space gave off an eerie vibe. Bright floodlights on the prison wall cast a long shadow of my father's body as he trudged past the empty basketball courts. He came up to the front door of the chapel, and when he did, a wave of nervousness came over him. At the time, he didn't know why. He pushed the large oak door open and stepped inside. He flicked on the light switch and started checking some of the small rooms at the front of the building. After a few minutes, a man walked out of the office at the back of the chapel. He seemed to be another guard, wearing the same uniform as my father. However, my dad didn't know this guy. It wasn't unusual, since sometimes guards from the day shift would take a night shift for extra money or to cover for someone. Even still, he was confused because his boss had asked him to check the chapel. Why would he do that if someone was already there? My father asked the man, "Are you here to do a sweep of the chapel?" "Yes, I'll take it from here," the man replied. My dad stood there confused for several seconds, then said, "Oh, okay, I'll let the boss know." He left the chapel and walked back to his boss's office in the main building. His boss looked up from his desk and said, "How did you get done so fast? You couldn't have possibly checked the whole place in such a short amount of time." Another guard was there. He said he'd check it out, my dad replied. Okay, as long as someone checked it, the boss said. My dad was confused at this point. He figured the other guard must have been sent there by someone. If his boss didn't know, then who was that guy? 3 days later, my father was walking down the halls of the prison and stopped to look at the display case. There were various awards and old photos of other guards from times in the past. As he was browsing through the photos, he saw something that made his heart sink. One of the pictures was a memorial to a guard who had been killed in a riot about 20 years ago. The picture was of the guard that my father saw in the chapel that night. He had never been a believer in the paranormal before, but this experience caused him to change his mind. He didn't bother to tell any of his co-workers out of fear that he'd be ridiculed. Not long after, he left the job and made a career change. Although this was a terrifying incident for him, it is one of his favorite stories to tell. I've heard it more than a few times from him, and although I wasn't sure at first, I actually do believe it. I am a 27-year-old male and I live in the UK with my fiancée. I currently work as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special needs in a school not far from Bradgate Park. I have worked in a number of schools and children's homes, and these buildings, especially the children's homes, are usually old, renovated houses or halls. This story happened in 2013 when I had just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults aged 18 to 30 years old who had autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked at was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house and an activity room that led to acres of fields and woodland. I had been working there for about 3 weeks and primarily worked the waking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all the residents were settled for the night and then get the cleaning done before the day staff came in to take over. I would usually get all my jobs done around 1 a.m. and spend the rest of the night listening to anyone who woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course textbooks, or just play some games on my phone once I was finished. The residents usually slept all night. On one particular night, a young man named James, not his actual name, was particularly restless. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him. One time, he got into one of his bad moods and threw a member of the staff through a patio door because she had forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences and would communicate with fairly simple words put together in a way that he understood. For example, he would say something like James make breakfast when he was ready to make breakfast, or James go outside if he wanted to go out and play. He was generally well behaved and could be quite funny when he wanted to be, but he was known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself. Then he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye on his door for maybe 15 minutes to make sure he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he had settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James' bedroom was a communal living room with board games, a TV, a sofa, books and stuff like that. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something drop in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went up the stairs and knocked on the door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm, and his eyes must have been half shut like he'd been asleep. I asked if he was okay. He said yes and put his thumb up. This was something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out, so I left him to it and told him to be careful, thinking that he had knocked something over by accident. An hour passed, and by then I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another big bang above me again, like something had been dropped. This time I realized that the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house had been set up for 5 residents, but there were only 4 at the time, and the room above me was the spare. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Due to their conditions, each resident had an alarm fitted to their door that was activated at night. That way, if anybody left their room, a small receiver box would sound an alarm. The night staff carried around the box, and it made a little noise to indicate which door had been opened. The alarm had not gone off, so I was puzzled. I was walking down the aisles of the store while my car was parked outside. I filled my basket with a few essentials that I always buy: bananas, eggs, and bread. Then, I walked around for a while trying to decide if there was anything else that I wanted. I eventually made my way to the till and paid for my gas, as well as the grocery items. I walked out the large glass door at the front of the store. I could see that my car was parked next to one of the pumps. The parking lot was dark, but the bright lights from the gas pumps were like a bright oasis. I started walking towards my car, and as I got closer, I could tell that there was somebody sitting in my back seat. I don't usually lock my doors when I go in because it's usually pretty quick, but this time I was in there for a while longer than normal. Also, my car is pretty old, so you have to lock them all manually. I know it's not smart, but those are my excuses, so take it for what you will. I inched closer to get a look at the person. It appeared to be an older woman, hunched over, her hair covering most of her face. The shade from the roof of my car formed a dark corner in the back seat where she was sitting, so it was hard to tell much about her. My first thought was that it was an elderly woman who wandered into my car, confused. I stood a few feet away from the car while I thought about the situation. I considered simply giving her a ride to wherever she was going. I'm always willing to help people in need, but some part of me thought that was not a good idea. After a minute or two, I decided to call the police. I hate to get the police involved for something like this, and I made sure that they knew it was not an emergency or anything. Also, I did not want to press any charges. When the police arrived, I talked to the officers for a few minutes. After that, they told me to wait by the building to give them some distance. I couldn't see much from there, and the bodies of the 2 police officers were blocking what little view I might have had. I could tell that they opened the back door of my car, and before I knew it, they had pulled the person out of the back seat and put her in handcuffs. I thought that was unnecessary, so I ran over shouting for them to stop. In my mind, it was just a confused old woman who wandered into my car by accident. But as I got closer, I could tell that it was not a woman at all. It was an older man, probably 50 or 60 years old, with long gray hair and several large tattoos on his face and hands. For some reason that I never figured out, he seemed to be wearing a hospital gown over his clothes. I stopped in my tracks when I realized that. Then, one of the officers yelled at me to stay back. I backed up a few steps and continued to watch in disbelief. My heart sank when I noticed something. When the man was being frisked, I saw them remove a large hunting knife from under his gown. I've been a security guard for over a decade now, and in that time I've seen some strange things. However, nothing could have prepared me for the night when this story took place. It was 2018 and I was working the night shift at a downtown hotel. The job was really easy. I was really into sci-fi books at the time, and I had a lot of time to read. There was a security office at the back of the building where I spent most of my time. Other than that, I would do a few patrols of the building and the parking lots every few hours throughout the evening. It was a typical quiet night at the hotel. I was making my rounds, checking doors and windows, when I heard a loud noise coming from the parking lot. At first, I thought it might be a car backfiring, but as the noise continued, I knew something was wrong. It was 2:30 in the morning, and the place was an absolute ghost town. Any noise at all stood out like a sore thumb, so those loud thuds I was hearing in the parking lot were very concerning. I immediately called the police and then headed towards the source of the noise. As I approached the parking lot, I saw a figure in a hoodie trying to break into a car. My heart was pounding in my chest as I shone my flashlight at him and ordered him to stop. As soon as I let those words out, he took off running. I chased after him, my breaths coming in gasps as I tried to keep up. I just needed to stay with him long enough for the police to show up. He was fast, and I was starting to lose ground when he suddenly disappeared. I stopped and shone my flashlight in every direction, but I saw no sign of him. Just when I thought I lost him, I heard a faint noise coming from a nearby alley. My hand went to my weapon, which was a can of pepper spray, as I cautiously approached. That's when I saw him. The man was hiding behind a dumpster, trying to catch his breath. I ordered him to surrender, but he refused. He came at me with a wild look in his eyes and then jumped on me. Before I knew it, we were rolling around on the ground, fighting. I was cursing myself for following this man. I should have waited for the police, I thought. The man was strong, but I was able to overpower him and subdue him until the cops arrived. The man turned out to be a wanted felon with a long history of violence and theft. It's been a few years now, but I still think about that night. The feeling of fear, the adrenaline rush, and the physical struggle with the criminal will always be part of me. I'm grateful for the training I received, and I know it helped me handle the situation as best I could. However, I also know that being a security guard is more than just making rounds and checking doors. It's about being prepared for anything. When I was 20 years old, I was working at a gas station on the other side of town from where I lived. I had recently finished high school and took the night shift as a way to make extra money since my main job didn't pay very much. The gas station was open all night, but my shift was from 7 p.m. until midnight, which worked out well since my other job ended at 5 p.m. Sounds like a rough schedule, and it was, but if I'm being completely honest, the work was really easy. It was made even better by the fact that I really got along with all my coworkers. The actual store never got very busy since most people would pay at the pump anyway. The night was usually a combination of scrolling through Instagram and cracking jokes with my coworker, occasionally being interrupted by a customer asking where the bathroom is. The late shifts always had 2 workers, not because it was busy but for safety reasons. It's always best to have another person around to watch your back, and my coworkers and I took this responsibility very seriously. This incident took place on a Thursday night at around 11 p.m. It was me and one other guy, John. He was younger than me, 18, I think, and he was still in high school. He had short red hair and a smooth face. I don't think he even needed to shave yet. I'd been working there longer than him, and we had kind of a big brother, little brother dynamic between us. He would ask me how to do everything, even though I'm pretty sure he was smart enough to figure it out for himself. It was the middle of August, and even though it was late at night, the store was incredibly hot. Because of that, we would often prop open the door to the back alley. That way there would be some nice airflow whenever someone walked in the front door, always a welcome relief from the summer heat. All that being said, John and I had a great time talking and joking around when the store was empty during the late hours. I was at the front of the store tidying up some of the shelves, and John was in the back organizing the stockroom when I noticed two cars pull up to the front of the store. One of them was an old sedan with some noticeable rust spots on the body, and the other was a white minivan with tinted windows. The minivan went to one of the pumps, and the car parked in one of the spots at the front. I quickly finished what I was doing and made my way back to the counter in case one of them needed to pay for something. At this point, I was not sure if the two were together. I suspected that they probably were because very few customers come in at this hour, and two vehicles arriving at the same time was unusual. I waited for a few minutes, and eventually a single man walked into the store. He was a short guy, probably 30 years old, and thin as a twig. He was wearing a white tank top and baggy blue jeans that seemed at least a few sizes too big. He looked straight at me with a blank look on his face. The man walked towards me, not breaking eye contact. As he approached the counter, I saw him reach behind his back, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a handgun. The store had a silent alarm that could be activated discreetly, but I was a few steps away from it and couldn't risk making a move. John was in the back, and I knew he could hear whatever was going on in the store, so I said loudly, "No problem, sir. Don't shoot. Take whatever you want." That should have been enough for John to call the police. However, when I said that, the man rolled his eyes and smiled. Then he looked over at the back room, his smile fading. He called out, "Hey kid, get out here." John hesitated, but eventually walked out, his face pale. The man ordered both of us to empty the register and hand over the money. We complied, trying to keep our hands from shaking. The man took the cash and backed out of the store, keeping the gun trained on us until he was out the door. As soon as he left, I ran to the door and locked it, then rushed to the phone to call the police. John was already on his phone, probably calling his parents. The police arrived quickly and took our statements. They assured us that they would do everything they could to catch the guy. The whole experience was terrifying, but I was grateful that neither of us was hurt. The store manager gave us both the next few days off to recover from the shock. After that night, I was much more cautious about my surroundings and always made sure the silent alarm was within reach. It was a reminder that even in a quiet job, danger could be just around the corner. One night I stopped for gas on my way home from work. I worked at a restaurant, so I was usually there until late, sometimes after midnight. This time it was about 11:30 at night. I would pass this gas station every day on my way home from work, and I'm pretty sure it was open 24/7. The store part of the gas station was bigger than most. It was almost like a tiny grocery store because it had a decent selection of food, not just the junk food and snacks like some others. This place even had a tiny produce aisle. Because of that, I would often pick up some things there after filling up my car, since other places in the area were usually closed at the time. I was walking down the aisles of the store while my car was parked outside. I filled my basket with a few of the essentials that I always buy: bananas, eggs, and bread. Then, I walked around for a while, trying to decide if there was anything else that I wanted. I eventually made my way to the till and paid for my gas, as well as the grocery items. Then, I walked out the large glass door at the front of the store. I could see that my car was parked next to one of the pumps. The parking lot was dark, but the bright lights from the gas pumps were like a bright oasis. I started walking towards my car, and as I got closer, I could tell that there was somebody sitting in my back seat. I don't usually lock my doors when I go in because it's usually pretty quick, but this time I was in there for a while longer than normal. Also, my car is pretty old, so you have to lock them all manually. I know it's not smart, but those are my excuses, so take it for what you will. I inched closer to get a look at the person. It appeared to be an older woman hunched over. Her hair was covering most of her face, and the shade from the roof of my car formed a dark corner in the back seat where she was sitting, so it was hard to tell much about her. My first thought was that it was an elderly woman who wandered into my car, confused. I stood a few feet away from the car while I thought about the situation. I considered simply giving her a ride to wherever she was going. I'm always willing to help people in need, but some part of me thought that was not a good idea. After a minute or two, I decided to call the police. I hate to get the police involved for something like this, and I made sure that they knew it was not an emergency or anything. Also, I did not want to press any charges. When the police arrived, I talked to the officers for a few minutes. After that, they told me to wait by the building to give them some distance. I couldn't see much from there, and the bodies of the 2 police officers were blocking what little view I might have had. I could tell that they opened the back door of my car, and before I knew it, they had pulled the person out of the back seat and put her in handcuffs. I thought that was unnecessary, so I ran over, shouting for them to stop. In my mind, it was just a confused old woman who wandered into my car by accident, but as I got closer, I could tell that it was not a woman at all. It was an older man, probably 50 or 60 years old, with long gray hair and several large tattoos on his face and hands. For some reason that I never figured out, he seemed to be wearing a hospital gown over his clothes. I stopped in my tracks when I realized that. Then, one of the officers yelled at me to stay back. I backed up a few steps and continued to watch in disbelief. My heart sank when I noticed something. When the man was being frisked, I saw them remove a large hunting knife from under his gown.